Welcome to the 371st of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID 19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome Elizabeth Elsasore, author of In Case of Emergency How Technologies Mediate Crisis and Normalize Inequality, which is forthcoming in the spring of next year. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle at US of Disaster or at COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, November 3rd, 2021, there are 5,011,786 deaths from COVID 19, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is She Could Really Look Beyond People's Flaws and See Their Potential. Oconomowoc paraprofessional dies at age 32 from COVID 19. This is written by Evan Frank, appeared in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Even when Kelly Burnett was young, she wanted to help others. When she was in high school or even middle school, my oldest son was diagnosed with autism, said Christina Klein, Burnett's sister. She really took an interest in special needs kids then and went to the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. From there, she was a therapist at Wisconsin Early Autism Project for a while and moved on to be a paraprofessional. Burnett, who grew up in Mukwonago and moved from Oconomowoc to Heartland in the last couple of years, died October 25th of COVID 19, her sister confirmed. Burnett was 32 years old. She worked as a paraprofessional for the past 5 years at Silver Lake Intermediate School in Oconomowoc. Kelly will be deeply missed by her family, our school, and our community, Silver Lake Principal Jill Marr wrote to parents in an October 26 letter. She had such a positive impact on the lives around her. Kelly was a selfless person who was always willing to help others and was so supportive of her family, students, and staff. According to Oconomowoc Area School District's COVID 19 dashboard, as of October 27th, the most recent data available, there are 26 students and 3 staff members throughout the district who currently have COVID 19. The district currently has face to face learning 5 days a week. Face coverings are recommended for students, staff, and visitors. On school buses and vans, face coverings are required by federal mandate. Vaccinations are not required for students, staff, or visitors. It's unknown whether Burnett had been vaccinated. Burnett and her husband, Tom, had 3 sons, Max, Luca, and Benny. A 4th child, Noah Joseph, was stillborn during Burnett's fight with COVID 19. It was very much about teaching the children and making sure they knew about civil rights and things like that, Klein said. The past year, she was actually homeschooling them. So she would go to school, and when she would get home from school, she would teach them. Klein said when her sister would walk into a room, everything would shift. She could really look beyond people's flaws and see their potential, Klein said. She was able to really see these kids who maybe themselves didn't even think they could do that much and see they could do a lot. She inspired them to do that. Also, it was very important to her that kids were aware of other people's differences and cultures. Burnett attended River Glen Christian Church in Waukesha. She was always the person who would find the loneliest kid in the room and go be friends with them, even when she was a little girl, Klein said. Everyone thinks their loved one was super great, but she really was. I don't know of anyone who didn't like her. GoFundMe account was set up to assist Burnett's family. As of October 29th, it had raised over $5,000 in funds. She loved her family so much, Klein said. She was always there if we needed anything. Okay, I'd like to turn to conversation for today, and let me introduce my guest, Elizabeth Elsasore. Elizabeth Elsasore is an associate professor of media studies at the University of Virginia and a senior faculty fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. Her research focuses on media access as a variable and uneven phenomena that advantages some and marginalizes others. She's the author of Restricted Access, Media, Disability, and the Politics of Participation, and the book In Case of Emergency: How Technologies Mediate Crisis and Normalize Inequality, which is forthcoming in spring of next year. Elizabeth Elsasser, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I've listened to the podcast intermittently over the past 370 episodes, I suppose. So I'm excited to be here and honored to talk about how my work fits into this bigger picture.
Intermittent is the way to do it. I don't know how anybody could have listened to all, except I think my in-laws have, John and Susan Merling, and I always give them a shout out for that. They are my most
Hi.
devoted listeners. So look, let's start the way I usually do, which is just to find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation is there.
Yeah, so I am based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I looked it up this morning. It looks like we have a 7-day average of about 1,300 cases per day in the state of Virginia, which is down from a peak in September when Delta was higher. Just about 75% of adults in Virginia are vaccinated, and we are in the midst of a flurry of scheduling for children 5 to 11, which is also where my children are. So we are seeing those scheduled in the next week and a half to get started. So all in all, as COVID goes, Virginia has been not the worst place to be. We've had at UVA mask mandates, now vaccine mandates for students, for faculty, for staff, which means that while obviously we still have cases and our hospital still serves a larger Central Virginia region, in Charlottesville, it is beginning to feel more normal, but also feel like a new normal in which we become used to certain measures of distancing, masking, as part of our everyday.
How did that play out on the campus? Was there much discussion, argument, anger at all, or did things move pretty seamlessly into that sort of new mode of living and learning?
I think there were some bumps in the road. Certainly there were a few crackdowns early on where students were not masking, or there were large gatherings in 2020 when there shouldn't have been large gatherings. And by and large, I would say that people acclimated to some degree. And that going back to in-person classes this fall, the vaccine mandate was very welcomed by most students.
Mhm.
The mask mandate has been harder for them to agree with, right? They feel like they've already been vaccinated, they've already taken some sorts of steps. But there's been a real effort to sort of protect the students and the community through continued masking.
I think that's going to be, there are different kinds of public health messages there, and it's hard. I mean, you get the vaccine and you forget about it and you move on with your life. The masking helps prevent the breakthrough infections. I had a conversation yesterday with two advocates for long COVID research and policy, and you don't want to get it. I mean, we've talked about it like you will die or not die, and that's not the right choice. I think it's you don't want to have it, and describing what they've been through was just really terrifying. So you had an election there in Virginia. I think everybody knows about this. Even here in South Korea, we know about this. And I know you're at the Miller Center, but you're not a political scientist. So I don't want to have you read the all of the exit polls for me. However, I'm curious about how much the pandemic played as a issue in the campaign.
To my knowledge, the pandemic was not a focus in either Youngkin or McAuliffe's campaign. What we did see was, I think Youngkin's campaign emphasized the sort of evils of critical race theory, but they tied it to very real frustrations that people had with online school over the past year, right? They tied this idea of parents being concerned about the children's education, which is a reasonable thing. My children were in online school, to critical race theory and to a broader sort of re-entrenchment of whiteness in the state after what's been a really eventful year of taking down the statues, of the case against the organizers of the Unite the Right rally currently moving through the courts. We have had some real shifts in Virginia in the past couple of years, and I think some backlash to that is expected. And some of it is sobering, in that I think the pandemic doesn't necessarily play into the campaigns or the issues of this election. But under Northam's administration, we had an executive order requiring masks in K through 12 schools. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to see go away very quickly when we have a change in administration.
Well, thank you for talking about that. I think it is really. I'll be watching to see how much the pandemic it plays a role in these various campaigns. I guess I'm a little surprised that it didn't play a bigger role there. But to shift the conversation, it's interesting you point out. Even online schooling could be an area where you could have a debate, like a real discussion and debate. But
Yeah.
to not talk about that in terms of protection of kids or teachers, and to flip it over to talk about critical race theory. I guess to me that's just like
It's a sleight of
predictable.
hand.
It's
Yeah.
it's a sleight of hand, and it's also, yeah. Well, those Robert E. Lee statues were big. The one in Richmond was enormous. It's down, but maybe this is a bit of a backlash to that in some ways. I guess we'll find out. Well, thanks for talking about that.
Yeah, of course.
I've been asking guests also if they wouldn't mind describing a pandemic memory that encapsulates this time for them. I wonder if you would do the same.
Sure. I think I want to start off just by saying that I've been very lucky. No one in my family has had COVID. Everyone in my extended family has been eager to be vaccinated as soon as possible. We've been as safe as we can be, which I am absolutely not minimizing. Which means, however, that some of my strongest sort of COVID memories are about the decision making that went on as a parent of young children. When COVID came into our lives, my daughter was 3, right? She was still in daycare. And so these moments of making decisions, like, do we send her back to a daycare setting, were intense moments of decision and anxiety and fear on all sides, right? Because it's not an easy decision to send a child into a setting like that in that moment. But it's also not easy to commit to keeping a 3-year-old at home and continuing to work from home without childcare. And so we had several of those decision moments. My daughter's 5 now. She's in kindergarten. She's in person wearing a mask. And these things shift. But I think that experience, that sense of, as a parent, like taking protective action, was really intense in a way that I actually hadn't experienced prior to COVID.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that for many of us, I count myself there too. That was, aside from the worry about if someone in the family was sick, that was the next thing you were going to pour your concern into. And it was a hard time. I know a lot of people are not past that yet. They still have some kind of modified learning for their children. So let's talk a bit about your research, and I'd like to start, if we could, by talking about your first book, which appeared with NYU Press, Restricted Access: Media, Disability, and the Politics of Participation. I'd like to talk about it, and particularly the way you see that book now, looking back through the lens of COVID.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I'm proud of the work in that book, but it is absolutely part of a different sort of era in how we think about um, disability and online media, frankly. And I think that has to do with the framing of the book itself, which is that I was interested in how claims about how the internet fosters participation and makes things more accessible uh, did and did not play out in disability communities. And so that book offers archival work and ethnographic work to try to understand what digital accessibility looks like and why it looks that way, why we have the sort of guidelines that we have, what kind of workarounds disabled people have put into place, and so on. And so I think a lot of the things that we've come to understand better through COVID were already evident in some ways in that book. Because that book chronicles a situation in which, for many disabled people, online access was partial at best. This was written even before things like the Target and Domino's lawsuits that extend digital access to commercial spaces. Disability inclusion wasn't taken seriously by a lot of institutions. Accessible event planning was not something on many people's radar. And yet at the same time, we already had disability communities using online tools in innovative and productive ways to socialize, to innovate, and to support one another. All of these are things that we see sort of in the COVID era when this becomes something that, quote unquote, everyone has to deal with. Zoom cocktail hours and remote learning, and all of these things are things that disabled people have done or asked for decades. And COVID revealed that these things were possible with sufficient will, which in some ways becomes a sad coda to that book, right? The things that were not possible as of 2016 were not, technically impossible. They were a matter of choices and decisions that were being made.
So it must have been quite something as the pandemic was unfolding, because you had these connections made through research, I suppose, in disability activist communities and people who'd been advocating for various kinds of accommodation. And so then all of a sudden the whole world, the world that has the ability to, shifts over into Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been described to me by others. So like, oh, you all caught up to what we've been living with, right? So what was that like? What kind of conversations were you having in March of 2020?
So I think one thing that was really poignant for me in March in particular was that I was in the middle of teaching a disability and media course, which I had already designed around the idea that students might not always be able to be present and might take longer to complete certain assignments and might need multiple means of accessing materials. And so our movement online was oddly smooth. The classroom component was only ever part of what we were doing. And to see that in contrast to the scramble that a lot of my colleagues were put through to try to figure out how to reinvent their courses because they had never given these things serious consideration was a real, I can't find the word I want, but it was a real sort of justification of the work I'd already done. Like, okay, this was the right thing to do. And certainly access increased in those moments. But I just want to point out too that it was always, even then, partial. Zoom captions were a premier tier feature for about almost a year before they became rolled out more broadly. And you still have to ask the host of a meeting to turn them on. So for someone who needs captions, right, there's still a moment of negotiation. Access is still something that has to be discussed and fought for in these spaces.
Do you have other examples of this sort of partial accommodation, things where, maybe it gets to a certain distance and then for people who might not need the accommodation, they say, oh, we've made an effort and I'm glad we were able to do that, and it stops there?
Yeah, I think actually accommodations around attendance in a university setting are something where we see that partial structure happen a lot. A lot of people have been told that they need to be flexible with attendance for students who have COVID or a roommate with COVID or something COVID related. But you always should have been flexible for students with chronic illness, right? You always had students who were going to need different kinds of accommodation around attendance and maybe not ask for them. So there's a way in which we still see COVID treated as an exception that's going to go away, as opposed to be connecting it to a larger experience of disability and chronic illness that frankly is not going to go away. And as we discussed with long COVID a second ago, is probably going to be exacerbated and expanded.
I just want to come, back to your book, and in the subtitle, you use the phrase "the politics of participation," and I'm curious about and how you see that. Um,
Mhm.
Bringing it maybe not into sort of like two-party politics, or at that level, although that's interesting too. Um, what are the politics of participation? What are the vested interests against participation, and who's having the most success in moving the needle in terms of bringing public awareness that this is a political issue? It doesn't move on its own, and
Mhm.
framing it in such a way that the public can get their mind around it and actually get behind accommodation as a principle.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because when I think about the politics of participation, I'm thinking about it in a context that feels distant now, and in which we thought that online participation was a self-evident good. And I don't think we think that anymore, right? I don't think we need to push back on that in exactly the same way. But I do think that part of what I was attempting to demonstrate is that participation is not the same for everyone, that participation looks different, and that the kinds of participation that we value have political implications for the kinds of voices that are heard and experiences that are normalized. So I think part of what comes out of that is a sense that certainly in some moments of our digital history, disabled voices have been largely absent, right? There has been a lack of participation due to inaccessibility, which makes it harder then to advocate for accessibility. And so like I said, have seen changes to that in the past 10 years. It doesn't look like it did when I first did this work. But some of it is still worthwhile, in that some forms of participation are still valued differently than others. And the forms of participation that we see among disabled communities are often forms of participation that are glossed over when we talk about what is valuable or what is recognizable. I think taking it to protest and electoral politics, one way we see that is that there was a period in which people were very dismissive of online activism,
Hmm.
right? You're just virtue signaling. That's just,
Right.
clicktivism. It doesn't actually change anything. You need boots on the streets, etc. Um, but that's the kind of participation that some people can offer, right? If you have limited mobility, if you have chronic illness, if you have other kinds of barriers to in-person political participation, then online participation is what you can do. And devaluing that because it is, different, looks different, means writing out people who are doing that work.
Wow, it's really fascinating the way just as you said, too, describing a world in this sense that has changed so much since 2020. The idea that someone couldn't meaningfully participate in the political process or in education if they were distant. And
Hmm.
then everything we saw with Black Lives Matter, yeah, I mean, the focus has been on what happened in the streets, but an enormous amount of activism took place, obviously at a distance. Um,
Absolutely.
and then, of course, with education, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about who the decision makers are in some of these cases. I think if we're,
Mm.
working in universities, most of us, if we're educators, are used to interacting with some version of an Office of Disability Resources, Office of Disability Services. I think same would be true for larger companies, maybe not even for medium-sized companies, that they would have a dedicated office there. So, I mean, I guess what I am sort of curious about is not necessarily what happens with the courtroom, but what happens at the point of actually administering accommodation, administering rules. Have you seen much change in what happens in those offices, who works in those offices, how they understand the law and their own role in bringing participation to life?
Yes and no.
Mm.
I think we've seen some moments of relaxation in which, for instance, those offices stopped asking for proof of diagnosis for some accommodations. They had a more streamlined process, particularly for students, but also sometimes for faculty and staff or employees. But we also see uh, reluctance to make those changes. As you mentioned, having an Office of Disability Services or a dedicated person is not super typical, right? Universities often have one or the other, but even at many universities, if you're a disabled faculty member, it's very unclear who you're supposed to talk to about accommodation. HR, maybe, and HR very rarely has somebody dedicated to this. So one thing to sort of think about this moving forward, there's a document put out called Beyond High Risk by a group called the Accessible Campus Action Alliance that tries to lay out the kinds of changes that are necessary to learn from COVID and make the changes that would make universities continue to be accessible. One thing in there that I think is particularly important is talking about funding and hiring. A lot of the times we treat accessibility for disability as if it is um, unskilled labor. When faculty members are asked to record their own lectures and nobody checks to see if they captioned them and nobody checks to see if the PDFs are accessible, and there's no staff member who can tell you how to make your PDFs accessible if you need to, you have a whole mountain of work that's being put on people who don't know how to do it and don't necessarily know why they need to. You have disabled students who are often being asked to do this work for themselves because maybe their professors don't know how. So tell your professor how to make your course accessible. In that shift to remote access, what I would have liked to see is the hiring of people who actually know something about
Mm.
disability accommodation and specifically digital media accessibility. And that rarely happens. And so that I think is one of those signs that the expansion of access was always envisioned as temporary. There was no investment in it at the level of funding and hiring. There was always a sense that we can do this for a little while and then pull back to a more reasonable normal.
Is that what you're seeing right now in terms of the Zoom transition in higher ed? And I assume by extension, any companies that have gone online since the beginning of the pandemic, that it was treated as sort of a all hands on deck to make this happen administratively, and then those offices are not going to grow post
I
pandemic.
think that's what I'm seeing is that those
Mm.
offices are not going to grow and that accommodation is increasingly being denied. There have
Mm.
been several instances of faculty members who are immunocompromised asking not to return to the classroom as a matter of ADA accommodations and being told that that's an unreasonable accommodation because it fundamentally changes the nature of the service. Well, we all fundamentally changed in that way for a year, right? We've seen that we can do online education, but we're also seeing a real reluctance to treat that as a viable accommodation moving forward.
This is something I think we're going to need a lot more research and attention to, because I know, throughout last year, disability activists, at least the ones I talked to, there was hope, kind of
Mhm,
measured hope, that this moment was a moment of sort of broad education, that
mhm,
yes, you can actually participate fully. It's just different. It takes some learning, but at a distance, and that also this accommodation is, it shouldn't be stigmatizing. It is what it is. It's an accommodation to allow people to do the things that they need to do: work, live, and go to school. But I was worried about that in this sense that to advancing fundamentally, if you're thinking about advancing civil rights, the idea was that the great majority of people would become aware of it and say, "Oh yeah, that's a civil right that everybody should have." And I don't know if that discourse really ever took place in that way.
Mhm.
I think it
Yeah.
it it sort of broke down into, "Oh, we should get back or we shouldn't get back," but the deeper questions about what does it mean to not be in person and what that might mean for everybody, I didn't hear that discourse the way I wanted to hear it. I guess maybe you were listening more closely than I was.
No, I didn't hear it either. There was very much, if we look at specifically sort of the return to normalcy of the past couple of months, there's very much an address of non-disabled people. There's an assumption that you don't have COVID, you're fine, you're not disabled. We should all go back to doing this the old way because that feels good. There's a sense that a lot of people are being left out of this return to normalcy, and we're resisting learning from the past year. It's as if a lot of people want to just erase what happened so that they can continue to think of it as exceptional rather than reframe their understanding of how society could work.
Just want to remind everyone that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Elizabeth Elsasore today about media and disability and technology. Just another question that I was thinking of since my discussion yesterday with Terry Akintunwa and Lisa McCorkle about long COVID. And Lisa McCorkle used this phrase that there's an enormous wave of disabled people
Mhm.
out there now because of long COVID. And the question that I have from that is, so now I'm thinking about public authorities and
Yeah.
government. How well do you think government has done or can do at all levels to take that on board in terms of modifying public services to meet what is going to be a new disability community that's come out of COVID-19?
So I think that's a really interesting question because I have to say to date, I haven't seen much evidence of public entities thinking of this wave in quite those terms. Um, there's a real strong tendency towards exceptionalism to see long COVID as something that happens to a small number of people rather than see the large number that all of those individuals add up to. I also think that long COVID is an amorphous experience and set of symptoms. And traditionally, when we look at how governments have responded to disability, they have tended to do better with concrete and easily identified diagnoses or conditions. So, for instance, histories of disabled veterans have shown that VA hospitals tend to do better with something like amputation and prosthesis than they do with PTSD. This is changing in recent years, but there's definitely a sense that the kinds of accommodations and the kinds of changes that might make life more livable for someone living with long COVID are not easy to pin down, right? It's not add captions, it's not get a wheelchair. It's something that actually challenges the way that we think about, I would say, both modalities and temporalities of daily life, right? How do we communicate something in more than one way? How do we allow people to do things at more than one time? These are big and important questions that are at the heart of accommodation for a lot of people. Is this question of how can I get information in a way that is accessible to me when I need it? And how can I do this in a way that is a time when I have the energy, the capacity to engage? So I think that things like asynchronicity are still big challenges that we haven't fully understood are going to be with us for a long time. We need to be able to, say, include people in the city council meeting, even if they can't be there at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. And that requires thinking really differently about what civic participation looks like and how people engage with governments and services.
I think that's really something we've got to watch, and asynchronicity idea is a really important one. It's one that I've encountered in a different way, just moving to South Korea and noting that things get scheduled on East Coast time, they get scheduled
Yeah.
on UK time, and the rest of the world just has to get. You have to participate at that time, or you don't participate. And if it's 3 a.m. in East
Hmm.
Asia, well, then that's just sorry, you're not gonna we'll catch you at the next meeting. It's
Yeah.
it's not because of any disability, but it's a mindset,
Hmm.
that this is when things occur and you either participate or you don't. It's just
Yeah.
one of the small ways that I think people are reminded that we're kind of locked into dominant frames of when and how we do things. And even small accommodations, even the suggestion of it seems to also provoke some backlash. And I think this comes back also
Yeah.
to the schools issue. Were you surprised by the ferocity of some of the backlash to distance learning that was requested last year? I mean, maybe it wasn't in Virginia, but in other states, that became a political flashpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's because, for one thing, if you assume that parents are largely my age or younger, uh, we didn't grow up with online learning. We had, a computer lab and maybe some typing classes.
Mm.
Um, and so there's a sense that this is something that is unknown. And certainly in my own experience, this was something that my son's first grade teacher didn't know how to do. Right? She was learning as she went, and she had very limited support, and was doing the best she could. But you see this shift happening, and it becomes, I think, just a really hard puzzle, as I was talking about earlier, trying to
Mhm.
decide what you do to preserve a sense of normalcy for your children, to keep them safe. There are good reasons to think about doing virtual education. There are good reasons to think about doing some kind of modified in person. Parents who are working were dealing with constant childcare issues, because that's not how our workday is set up, to have our children going to first grade beside us.
Just want to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Elizabeth Elsasore today. Let's talk about your new project, which I presume you started before the pandemic and finished it in the middle of the pandemic.
Correct.
We have not yet gotten too far into it that people started and completed projects in the pandemic, but um, I know people are excited about this book. It's coming out next year. In case of emergency, how technologies mediate crisis and normalize inequality. Why did you write this book?
So, as you said, I started this before COVID, in part because, one book can't do everything. And one of the things that I left out of the first project was how disability access is treated very differently in emergency contexts than it is in entertainment or even informational contexts. So, for instance, we rarely see sign language interpreters except during evacuation public announcements, right? We have to have live access in those moments, whereas we are not used to seeing that kind of accessibility foregrounded in, a regular night of watching television. So, thinking about that to begin with, I started thinking about all of the different ways in which emergency media systems operate differently than commercial and public and online media systems. And one thing that I wanted to really emphasize in this book is that we can think about emergency media in terms of who has access. But that only gets us so far. Calling for more access or expanding access to emergency services keeps us within a sort of liberal frame of gaining access to the world as it is. And I wanted to push a little bit past that to see how emergency media are actually involved in how we understand the very definition of what is an emergency. And that if we want to think about emergency differently, then we're going to have to also think about mediating it differently, understanding different kinds of circumstances as emergencies, and offering different kinds of resources and um, channels for people to communicate when they are experiencing emergency.
So this is obviously people who study disaster and risk communication are just like, okay, this is, and you published a really nice, I think, overview of the book in GCN.com in June of this year. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from it because I think
Mhm.
it's these are things people can relate to. You said it opens, you say, on a spring day in 2020, residents of El Paso, Texas saw their phones light up with a text message: avoid parks and family gatherings this Easter. Stay home, stay safe, do it for your loved ones. This message, sent via the Federal Wireless Emergency Alert System, was one of many designed to deliver COVID-19 related guidance directly to people's cell phones. And I thought it was interesting because we're maybe grown a little bit used to receiving Amber Alerts
Mhm.
on cell phones, but not this kind of communication. And it raises just this question: is this an emergency communication? I mean, the
Yeah.
context of COVID is a disaster. It's an emergency, although public officials in large parts of the United States also sent mixed messages of whether or not they
Yeah.
saw it as an emergency. So you turn on the television or the radio and you hear one set of messages, maybe coming from a governor's office, another coming from a mayor's office, a third coming from essential workers, first responders, and now my phone lights up and tells me what to do at Easter. It's a
Yeah.
complicated array of messages.
Absolutely. And I think you get at some of the real differences in this moment. And prior to 2019, something like 94% of messages sent via the emergency wireless alert system were weather alerts, right? We've seen those. Um, to suddenly use the system for something different introduces a lot of questions about what people's expectations are and whether you are communicating in a way that is accepted and understood. A lot of agencies didn't bother identifying themselves in their first COVID emergency alert messages, which really undermines people's sort of understanding and trust about what's happening, right? This message is on my phone. I don't really understand who sent it. I don't really understand if I should trust them. Um, and then when we get into messages that conflict or overlap, it becomes even harder to understand how to parse this information. I think one of the things that is really interesting in this case, too, is that sending an emergency alert, which comes through any number of alerting authorities, is intended to produce some sort of change in how we feel and how we behave, right? We're supposed to receive an alert of an emergency and act differently than we would if it were not an emergency. But that isn't always what happens. People can still receive these communications and make choices to ignore them, delete them, and most notably opt out of receiving future emergency alerts.
So this is there's so many angles to this. And one I wanted to ask you about is about repetition and what the data
Mhm.
shows, what the research shows about repetition. This is something that people who have the responsibility of giving evacuation orders, or people in emergency management offices who have to, if a storm is approaching. I mean, they really wrestle with this because they
Yeah.
know if they give an order and then the storm doesn't come, then people look back at that and then they assess whether or not they should have paid attention to those orders. And some people say, yeah, that's fine. I'll follow that even if it didn't work out. But there are many others who apparently the trust level goes down. So
Mhm.
now we're bringing that into media, that goes beyond what you hear on the news. It's actually arriving directly to me. What does the data show in terms of people's reaction to repetition?
So that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer about repetition per se, but I can say that one of the pervasive fears in FEMA and emergency management is about over alerting. That if we use the alert system too often, people will become inured to it. They'll turn it off. It will be like your neighbor's car alarm that goes off every weekend and you don't ever check to see if their car is okay. And so this fear of over alerting, I think in some ways leads to a decreased familiarity with the system. If we think back, if those of us who are old enough remember the tests of the emergency broadcast system, right? The sense that we knew what a test sounded like, and thus we knew what would happen if an alert came. Wireless alerts have largely moved forward without that testing, and certainly without a broader attempt to raise public awareness of what an emergency alert will look like and what you're expected to do with it.
Hmm.
These questions of trust and repetition come into play in part because people are looking for other external signs about how to behave. So there are a few fascinating articles about campus alerting and how college students react to getting alerts. And the first thing they do is look at each other, right? We all got this alert. What are you going to do about it? What are we going to do about it together?
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to do about it? Because they don't have a sense of what action is expected in that moment.
Let's talk for a moment about the emergency alert that went out in Hawaii. I
Yeah.
believe this was 2018. Is that right? People got or
I
2017.
think it was earlier, 2016, 2017.
People got an alert that told them that missiles were headed towards
Mhm.
Hawaii. This happened. I was just teaching. It was the beginning of a semester, and I was teaching a disaster studies class actually at Drexel University, and this was a really fascinating moment because just to your point just now, I asked the students in the class, well, what would you do if you had received this message? And it broke down sort of one third, one third, one third. One third said they would call their family members or they would
Mhm.
turn to somebody outside of the classroom, but in their social network for instruction. Another third said that they would look around in the classroom or to me
Yeah.
for guidance and instruction. And the other third said that they would just do whatever they were told to in that
Yeah.
moment. So what happened in Hawaii and what did we learn from that in terms of the emergency alert system?
Well, I think in Hawaii, we saw all of these reactions.
Hmm.
There were definitely people who took it very seriously and sought cover. There were also people who took it seriously and said, I'm going to the beach. If I'm going to, these are my last moments, I'm going somewhere I want to be. Um, Simultaneously, I've heard from residents of Hawaii that they were um, well aware of other emergency media in this area, sirens in particular, that would be activated in case of an actual missile threat. So when they get the text message and don't hear the sirens, they know something's wrong. Right. So you have all kinds of different reactions depending on what people's knowledge of that location is and what their expectations or sort of personal um, orientations might be to this disaster. I think one of the things that comes out of this example that's really useful is thinking about this question of how media don't only report emergency, they can create it. For people who received that alert and believed it, they felt emergency for 38 minutes until the next alert told them it was a mistake. Right? They felt this sort of panic, despair, calling their loved ones, all of this sort of stuff, because they were told it was an emergency. So in some cases, when we're talking about emergency media, it's not just that it alerts us to things that have actually happened, it's that it creates emergency in our experience, regardless of what's happening. And sometimes that attempt to deem something an emergency gets used for other purposes. In the book, I talk a little bit about how emergency alerts were used during Black Lives Matter protests to inform people of curfews, right? And so you have protesters who can't possibly get inside before the time of the curfew, receiving an emergency alert that they interpret, I think, quite rationally as saying that they are the emergency. And thus they blow it off. It's policing by emergency alert.
Is that when you use the phrase normalizing inequality in the title of the book? Is that the kind of thing that you have in mind?
In part, I think when we talk about a lot of our emergency media systems, they're based around a very straightforward emergency claim, in the words of a political scientist named Jennifer Robinson. Emergency claims suggest that something has gone wrong, it is not normal, and it can be fixed with some kind of intervention. Now, an emergency claim understood like that means that some events can be understood as emergencies really easily. My house is on fire. It wasn't on fire before. Please put the fire out. And some things don't register as emergencies in quite the same way. My neighborhood is prone to gun violence. It's been this way for 15 years. Please make it stop.
Mm.
Doesn't work as an emergency claim the same way my house is on fire does. And so these kinds of long disasters and exacerbations of inequality in the sociocultural context don't often read as emergencies, which means they don't often receive the same kinds of assistance, which means that often emergency functions in a fairly conservative way to keep things the way they are. Which is why towards the end of the book, I wanted to start pushing it towards thinking about redefinitions of emergency or other kinds of mediation that can incorporate more nebulous circumstances rather than constantly centering around this idea of a return to normal as if normal was always good. This takes us right back to what we were talking about with COVID, right? We don't necessarily want to end this by returning to exactly the way things were before. We want to be able to see this public health emergency and the tendrils of other emergencies it's created in people's lives and learn from that and create something different. So yeah, thinking about emergency response beyond a return to normalcy is a huge part of thinking about how emergency can become less invested in hierarchies and inequalities.
I think that is such a powerful insight, and it makes me think also that the emergency alert is circumscribed in such a way to make it seem apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
But if just some additional information is added, suddenly it becomes political. And here's what I mean, like a emergency alert. So here in South Korea, we get heat warnings. So
Oh.
it's not unknown that in the summertime I get a text message that will tell me it's going to be really hot today. And these are really probably aimed mostly at seniors.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be really hot today, so you need to modify what you're doing. I think in the United States, in some municipalities, you get these around air quality. If you opt
Mm-hmm.
in, it's going to be an air quality action day, so you need to modify your activities outdoors. And I always thought if they just added a few more characters to say, this is part of climate change, or
Yeah.
just to give a little more information of why you're getting so many of these now,
Mm-hmm.
that would tip it. First of all, that's exactly the information people need to know, but that's not the emergency, and so that's not involved in the discussion. That's kind of a couple of crude examples, but I think that may be moving into the territory that you're suggesting here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a great example of an alert that often treats every incident as isolated rather than as part of a bigger picture. And some of that has to do, I think, with um, an attempt to seem apolitical or a sense that alerts are not about broader education. But it gets back to some of what I was saying about trust as well, being able to provide that context, being able to educate the public about not only what this alert calls you to do, but why, is something that alerts can and should do in order to allow people to make sense of these things outside of discrete moments and see the bigger picture.
There's another facet of this that I'm interested to see how you connect to the Cold War, because when I was
Mm-hmm.
growing up, every Saturday at noon, the civil defense siren went off,
Yep.
and so you have an ambivalent reaction to, or I did. On the one hand, it's kind of scary, well, there's a siren going off, and the first few times it happened, my parents would explain, well, this is why this happens. it was meant to be reassuring, right? That the authorities were testing for the big ones, so that
Mhm.
when it came, you were going to hear the siren. But then when you get a little older, and then you ask your parents, well, what would happen if it went off?
Yeah.
The answer to that question is, well, we all die. So what was the point of the siren in the first place? It was to get us to do nonsensical things. So it's a performativity. It's a government. It's a government performing diligence. And Lee Clark and others have written about this extensively.
Absolutely.
So I like to know how you translate that into your work. Right now, I mean, if the government sends me a message, if a city or a state sends me a message, or the federal government saying, "Be concerned about COVID," um, but then they don't offer me any resources, or my governor is actively denying COVID, and these mixed messages. It's like the performance of care. It's the performance of
Mhm.
diligence. It's got me excited about it, and then I find out, oh, the whole political economy is wrecked. But I'm sure glad I got this text message.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting to connect to that sort of Cold War history because some of the COVID alerts do try to tell people what to do, and sometimes those instructions are, counterindicated a couple of weeks or months later. So recommendations about disinfecting your groceries go out, and then you don't actually have to do that. So we start to see instruction and attempts to provide information that are, um, as you say, potentially more a sign of government action, a sense that we are doing something, than they are effective. And they're also often pretty ignorant of context.
Mm.
So here in Virginia, we had a contact tracing app. It actually is still operative, called COVIDWise, that attempts to use Bluetooth to track the phones that your phone has been near. And if someone receives a positive COVID test and reports it to the Virginia Department of Health, then they will tell all the phones that were around your phone during that period. And that message, if you receive it, comes with instructions like, oh, now you need to quarantine for 2 weeks. But there's absolutely no support when we need to quarantine, right? You're not going to get lost wages. You're not going to get childcare to help during those weeks. You have actually no capacity to make the changes that are sometimes recommended. And so I think that's one area in which this kind of emergency mediation is um, not particularly effective. It may tell you what to do, but it provides no information about how to do that or how to receive support while doing that.
I mean, to me, and I don't want to sound cynical about this, I agree with you completely. And I'd go a step further and say that's a text message I'm receiving telling me to have a dysfunctional society. It's like, here's
Mm.
a warning, democracy is broken. I mean, I see the alert, but I see
Yeah,
something else behind it,
absolutely.
and I don't think I'm alone. I mean, in that regard, and I think I'm just really glad that you've done this work. I can't wait to get this book. We're almost up on time. I wanted
Oh,
to get
sure.
one more thing on the table before we wrap up, and that's about emergency information and data, and the way you see news
Mm.
media, legacy media, dealing with it. We live in an age of data journalism now. I read the statistics from the Hopkins coronavirus dashboard every day. The New York Times now has become a set of interactives. I mean, that's really
Yeah,
what when you go online and experience it. Um, I'm fascinated by that. I think obviously they keep doing it because people interact and then they see more advertisements or they move to other
absolutely.
news stories. I wonder what you think about that. Is this a permanent feature of media now? This sort of like interactive feature, and um, as we were talking about before, talking about really complicated things, um, and with the sort of seduction of the graph that then draws you in and makes you think that you've understood something when in fact maybe you didn't understand it as deeply as you thought you did.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of the points there that I would have brought up. Um, Particularly that I think interactive dashboards and so on are really great engagement engines for advertising driven pages. Absolutely, they keep people coming back and clicking and doing things in a way that print journalism doesn't. I also think that there is potentially a really clear legacy here to the kinds of election night maps that we're used to seeing, right? Which state is red, which state is blue. The kinds of color coding that we see on COVID maps, usually, but not always, moving from a sort of yellow to maroon, allowing us to interpret some things as better and some things as worse, are similarly simplistic. And you can engage in similar kinds of map critique about what it means when a very populous state is a certain color versus what it means when all of Montana is that color. These are not equivalent, but they're being presented as if they were. We also see these maps making choices about what kinds of data to include and not include that are really interesting. One example is that early in the pandemic, rates of COVID infection were displayed as higher in counties that had nursing homes or prisons, right? Congregate housing situations in which COVID was rampant. And what comes out of that is actually the New York Times now has a map of only nursing homes, so that the data in the aggregate doesn't include those counties as outliers to the same degree. Of course, the takeaway there is that nursing homes, prisons are being treated as outliers, as exceptions, and as not part of the sort of true numbers for those counties, right? As if those people don't really have COVID, or those people are not valuable in the same way. So I think we see a lot of this happening, both in an attempt to inform people and in an attempt to engage people. My worry about these kinds of data visualizations long-term is sort of twofold. First, they're almost always inaccessible to disabled people. Even creating alternate text for a static graph is difficult. Creating an accessible version of an interactive map that changes as you sort of mouse over it is extremely difficult, and frankly, most sites don't even try. So you have a whole host of people who are left out of these, either due to disability and accessibility concerns, lack of chart reading literacy, slow computers, location, broadband access, all of these things. But also, these are things that sort of trouble me, as I wouldn't call myself a historian, but I do historical work enough that I think about, if we did research into the 1918 flu, we can look at newspaper articles. In 50 years, looking at the Johns Hopkins map, I don't know what's going to be there, right? Digital artifacts are notoriously hard to preserve, hard to run on future systems. The database that powers those systems might still exist, but will it be accessible? There are real questions about how this mediation of information can or will persist in the future, or how much of it we're just going to lose, as soon as next year.
So just wrapping up real quick, next project?
Haven't decided.
Take a rest. The new one, the book's not even out yet. Sorry, I don't mean to pressure you.
The book's not even out yet. I'm tying up loose ends. I have bits and pieces on baby monitors and old phone trees where I call you and you call two people and they call two people, that I still want to put together in some format. I have a lot of data from student focus groups about campus safety and sort of impressions of what technologies make them feel safer and what don't. So I'm pulling a lot of that together. I'm also really coming to focus a lot on this access work that I talked about in terms of education contexts, but the work of making something accessible, the work of increasing access in various spaces is often left out of the stories we tell about media industries or educational contexts, or IT for that matter. So these are sort of marginalized workers. And so I'm interested in exploring that expertise moving forward.
Okay, well, we want to read all of it, so keep it coming. And just a reminder that the new book is In Case of Emergency: How Technologies Mediate Crisis and Normalize Inequality, and we'll be looking for that early next year. I want to remind everybody that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Today is a two-a-day COVID Calls for me. I'm in Asia. You'll be hearing a second COVID Calls episode at 5:30 p.m. today, November 4th, Korea time. I'll be talking to Dr. Vipul Shah, who's an advocate for long COVID sufferers and for children in India. So please do join me for that. And let me thank my guest today, Elizabeth Elsasore, for a wonderful conversation. Thanks for making time. Learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.